Well, hello vintage outboard motor fans. This is T-Mike here on Toledo Bend Lake. I'm making another video today. Today's video is going to be on the volt ohm meter. That's right, I've been getting a lot of requests on how to use a volt ohm meter, and finally decided I'm going to break it down for you and show you. This is for beginners only. If you have no background in electricity or meters to measure electricity, then this is the video for you. If you have a background and you know how to do it already, this will be too simple for you. But my goal is to show a beginner what they need to know about a volt ohm meter and how it applies to working on their vintage outboard motors. We're not going to cover Ohm's law, we're not going to cover AC, DC, current, amperage, none of that. Just the basics on what you need to know to work on your vintage motor. Alright, so it's going to be a 4-part video. First part is going to be on the 2 different types of volt ohm meters. Second part of the video is going to be on voltage versus ohms. Okay, and the third part of the video is going to be on a circuit, what a circuit is, and help you understand how it works for electricity flow. And the fourth part are going to be the applications for vintage outboard motors. How do you use a volt ohm meter when it applies to your vintage outboard motors? So if everybody's ready, here we go. All right, part 1 of the video. It's on the 2 different types of volt ohm meters. So first type we're going to talk about is an analog meter. This is an analog meter. The second type is a digital volt ohm meter. Okay, so both meters have a battery inside. All right, so that battery is what is used when you connect the leads to any 2 points. This voltmeter, depending on what you have it set on, discharges this battery out one lead and expects to see it coming back on the other lead. So if you're measuring voltage, you set it on voltage and touch this to ground and this to the lead, it'll measure voltage. If you're checking ohmage and you set it across the 2 leads, it'll measure ohmage. And we're going to talk about all that later. Just understand that both these meters do the same thing. Both of them have a battery in it. That battery is used to discharge voltage across this lead through a circuit back on the other lead and make measurements. Okay, so let's go over the measurements on both the meters. They're both the same. There's an off switch where you want to keep it off so it doesn't discharge the battery. And then there's voltage settings. This range right here has a V with a wavy sign. That's AC voltage if you want to measure it there, and the different is 10 volts, 50 volts, 250, 300 volts. If you're measuring, want to look for 120 volts and you have it set on a 50 volt scale, you won't get a reading. Your range has to be higher than what you're looking for. Here is DC voltage scale right here. It's got a straight line. That DC is direct current. There's no sine wave in it. Then you have amperage readings down here we're not going to talk about. And then right here, the ohm signal. Looks like a horseshoe. That's what we're going to be interested in. We're interested in ohmage, and we're going to talk about that later. So you put the 2 leads across the points that you want to check, set your meter on the correct scale. I'll put it on ohms and touch my 2 leads together. Watch the needle. See the needle move? That's taking measurements across these 2 leads. We're going to talk about that later. So on an analog meter, You have to look at the numbers, the scale behind here, depending on what you're on, and you have to determine the number value of what you're looking for, either voltage or ohmage. On a digital meter, you set it on, there's the AC voltage scale, there's the DC voltage scale, there's a millivolt scale, and there's an ohmage scale. See the ohm sign? Ohms. That's what we want to know. Ohms is a measurement of resistance across a conductor. Okay? If it's short and a big conductor, it'll be closer to 0. 0 ohms can run through it. If it's longer and smaller, it'll be a higher ohms because it's more resistance, resisting the flow of electricity. We'll talk about that later. All right, so same thing. If I touch my 2 meters together, 2 leads, see it's got an overload reading. I touch my 2 leads together, it's got 0.2 ohms. Okay, so that's how you read ohmage. Same thing as the other meter. I prefer the analog meter, a little more expensive, but you get a number when you're testing for ohmage. And I'm going to show you when we're testing coils and spark issues later, you need that number. So I recommend the digital scale. All right, that's the end of part 1. That's the 2 different types of meters. Let's move on to part 2. We're going to talk about voltage and ohmage. Okay, here we go with part 2, voltage and ohmage. When it comes to vintage motors and a volt-ohm meter and electricity, these are the only 2 things that we need to be concerned with. All right, so let's start with voltage. So I think everybody knows what voltage is. Electricity is measured in volts. So the transformer that produces it is pushing electrons down a conductor, high power lines. It's pushing electrons back and forth, and they call it alternating current because it bounces back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it's looking for ground. When it finds the ground, completes the circuit, we're going to talk about the circuit next. When it completes the circuit, voltage flows. And you take a meter here and measure it. You put 1 lead of your meter to ground, the other lead on the wire, and it'll tell you the voltage on that wire. When it applies to vintage outboard motors, we don't really read voltage. The only electricity involved is the spark that the magneto run across the coil creates and induces a voltage that goes down the spark wire. That voltage, after it passes through the 2 windings of a coil, we're going to talk about that later, that voltage is so high, 20,000 to 40,000 volts, and so fast that a voltmeter can't really measure it. That's why the testers for measuring voltage on a spark wire are a visual tester, gap tester, that you can just see the spark. You don't really use a meter to measure spark. You measure it with the gap tester, and it needs to jump a 1/4 inch gap. That tells you that the strength of it is good. I've looked into it. You can buy spark testers. You plug the spark tester into it, and it applies a certain amount of voltage. The spark tester, that's what you need. Okay, so that's voltage. When it applies, as it applies to vintage outboard motors, we're not really concerned with it. We just want to see the voltage across a spark tester. All right, now let's go to ohmage. So ohmage, simple explanation of ohmage is that spark that's going through that spark wire and across the windings of a coil. There's resistance. All right, so if it was a short piece of wire, here's a short piece of wire. I'll measure the ohmage across this wire. And look at my meter. It measures 0.5 ohms. Ohms is a measurement of the resistance of the flow of electricity. So that battery in this meter is trying to get across this lead and looking for it to return on the other lead, and it's got very little resistance, short, 0.5 ohms. Now let's look at the winding of a coil, the primary winding of a coil. Okay, primary winding of this coil is 1 ohm. So it's only twice the resistance of that wire we just tested. All right, so it's 1 ohm of resistance. So that means it's a short coil, short piece of wire wrapped around this armature, only resisting the flow of the spark by 1 ohm. Now if we go from any of those leads out to the spark wire connection, we get 6.74 K ohms. See the K in front of the ohms? So that's 6,740 ohms. 6,000 ohms of resistance. Okay, that's a lot. That's less resistance. The closer to zero, the less resistance. So that winding is a long piece of winding with a lot of ohmage resistance. So you in testing for spark, we need to be able to measure the ohmage of these coils, and this is how you do it. Putting the meter across these two leads, the battery in here discharges, and it measures the resistance that it has across this circuit. All right, so that's the difference between voltage and ohmage as it applies to vintage motors. I hope I didn't make it too complicated. It's really pretty simple. We'll go over how it applies to measuring things in just a minute. All right, that's it for part 2. Let's move on to part 3. All right, now let's talk about what a circuit is. Okay, if you can grasp the technical background of what a circuit is, you'll understand how to use your meter on your vintage motors. All right, so a circuit is a complete circular path that electricity flows through. Okay, so here's a piece of wire. All right, it has 2 ends, they're bare. All right, if I take these 2 ends and put my voltmeter and put them and touch each other, touch them together, that's a circuit. Circular path that voltage runs through. All right, so if I take my voltmeter and I put it here and here, what have I done? Okay, this was a circular path without the meter on it. When I put the leads on it, it's a circular path. It goes from this lead, the red lead, out, across this lead, back through the black lead. That is a path. So the battery is discharging. It found a circuit, so it's discharging and trying to get an ohmage reading through this thing. 0.4 is what it reads. So that's a circuit. A circuit is a path. So when you're measuring across the points for your voltmeter, and you put the meter across it and you see no ohmage, and then when the contacts close, you're creating a circuit, which this meter measures the resistance and tell you that you have a closed circuit. That's what setting of points is all about. All right, so I hope that explains what a circuit is. That's the basic thing you need to know about electricity. Electricity requires a circuit. All right, this wire hooked to electricity going to ground creates a circuit. That is a circuit, either this or this. Okay, hope you understand. Now let's move on to part 4. Okay, so now in part 4 we're going to talk about the applications for a voltometer when it pertains to vintage outboard motors. Okay, so as I said earlier, we don't really measure voltage itself. We look for ohmage and resistance, and I talked about it earlier, spark. Okay, spark is so high, 20 to 40,000, and so fast, blink of an eye, that a meter can't really capture it. So we use a visual of a spark gap tester, and the amount of voltage needs to be a 1/4 inch gap. That's how we measure for spark. Okay, now let's talk about coils. Okay, if you have weak spark or no spark, first thing you want to do is test your coil. Okay, I've had several videos on how to do that, and I'm gonna go over it in here for beginners. I would take a digital voltmeter, set it on the ohm scale. You have your black lead, the common lead, connected here. You have the red lead connected where it says volts or ohms. That's how you connect your leads. And there's 2 windings in a coil. Okay, the primary winding is across these 2 leads. The secondary winding is any one of these two leads and the output of the spark. So here's where we need to know what ohmage is all about. So across that primary lead, all right, it's a short, big lead. We need to be between 0 and 3 ohms. We're at 0.9 ohms. That is a good primary coil, primary winding on a coil. That's how you test it. Then you take your meter and go from either lead, because it's a short. From either lead, you go to the output of the spark wire. Now you're going across the secondary winding, which is a small wire and it's a long wire. All right, you need to be between 3,000 and 10,000 on your secondary winding, and this one is at 6.75 k ohms. So 6,750 ohms is between 3 and 10,000. So the secondary winding of the coil is good. So that you've measured the resistance across the primary coil and the secondary coil. That's how you test the coil. All right, another application we used on is to set the points. So I've got several videos on setting points. You use a voltmeter and go across the contact points. All right, on that one you can use this meter or the other meter. All right, when you turn the timing tool, it should measure 0. It should measure a short with this meter. It should measure a closed circuit with this meter. And when the point's open, the circuit is opened, so you don't measure any more resistance. And of course we know that needs to happen right when the cam is on the top portion, or when the timing tool is between the two marks. Watch my videos on how to use those either the timing tool or a feeler gauge. But that's another application of using a voltometer, is for setting your points. Okay, and the last application we use is to look for opens or grounds. So a ground can cause trouble with spark. If your spark wire is grounded, you won't see any ohmage, you see a dead short to ground. If you put this on ground and this one on your spark lead, you should see the 6,000 ohms. If you see 0 ohms, then you have a ground somewhere, meaning that the battery that's discharged from this meter went to measure the resistance and it saw so much resistance to ground that it went to 0. Okay, so there's also kill switches or other things in there, wiring, that you would want to test continuity of the wire. Right, so if you set your meter here and here, you want to see 0 point something ohms, which I do, 0.5. If I don't get that, then it's an open. So you're looking for opens or grounds with a voltmeter. All right, so those are the 4 applications that you would use a voltmeter for when it comes to vintage outboard motors. How about that? All right, well, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Let's go ahead and summarize right now. So in part 1, we talked about the 2 different types of voltmeters, the analog and the digital. And in part 2, we talked about voltage versus ohms. Voltage is AC or DC, and ohmage measures the resistance of the conductor. Okay. Part 3, we talked about a circuit, what a circuit is when it comes to electricity. Okay. And in the 4th part, we talked about the applications. We talked about the voltometer being used to measure for spark, for measuring coils, for setting the points, or looking for opens and grounds. So I hope I made it clear. The simplest things are the most important things. Being able to use a meter on your vintage outboard motors is a huge success, make it a huge success, whatever project you're working on. So with those 4 sections covered, you should have everything you need to know about a voltometer when it comes to vintage outboard motors. See y'all next video. Thanks for watching the video. I hope y'all enjoyed it. If you did, please click on subscribe and tell all your friends about T Mike's Vintage Outboards YouTube channel. Also, I have dozens of links below in the description. You can find my eBay store, all the parts I have in there. You can find my trusted T Mike parts, where I make kits for fuel pump conversions, for your carburetors, for your magnetos and your gear cases. You also have a link for my mail-in repair service, how to send me your parts to repair and send them back to you. Also a link in there for technical consulting if you need some help with your vintage motors. So I love what I do. I love all the videos that you guys have requested for me. Keep the requests coming in, and I'll keep making the videos. And remember, always remember, and never forget, here at T-Mike's Vintage Outboards, we're doing it one motor at a time.